So, good afternoon, folks. Welcome back. My name is Phil Green. I'm the ServiceNow capability lead at Turnkey Consulting. For this presentation, I've got some backup support from colleagues at ServiceNow, Emlyn King, who's a GRC consultant, and also his manager, Alex Hollis. So, we're going to talk about value trapped in heritage systems and how we unlock the value, bringing it into the ServiceNow platform. Turnkey, as you know, is establishing a ServiceNow practice. So we're building our ServiceNow capability and leveraging our very deep heritage with SAP to bring the two together, the better together message, so that we can help customers get more out of any existing ServiceNow implementations they have without necessarily putting any of their SAP heritage at risk, and actually capitalizing on that heritage and adding more value. What we're going to talk about is a few things. We're going to look at the need for a real-time approach. We're going to talk about what this value is in your heritage systems of record, and then how we can get that value and basically use ServiceNow as a system of insight and action. If you look at today's challenges, what's become clear over the last 18 months or so is the need to move to a more real-time approach when it comes to risk and compliance. We've seen how the pandemic has shifted our risk exposures, produced disruption of supply chains, for example. We're also in a situation where our corporate endpoints are significantly more exposed through home working becoming more commonplace. And so your devices are a little bit more out of reach. And of course, we are seeing a lot of tactical, short-term legal and regulatory changes that we have to be able to understand and demonstrate a compliance with. But at the same time, the longer-term landscape of legal and regulatory requirements continues to change at a very fast pace. That diagram you see is depicting the clock ticking down to UK SOX, for example. And you think about Brexit. Brexit is actually going to make the regulatory landscape more complex, not simplify it, because we still need to do business with Europe. We still hold personal data on customers and employees in Europe. So we're bound by GDPR. You're going to be bound by other things like Solvency II. If the UK government brings in local legislation, then we've got the balancing act of compliance to local country legislation versus European legislation. So the whole environment becomes more complex. Our organizations are more complex. So we've got to deal with all of this operational complexity. And we have to deal with it fast. We can't spend months and months planning. I remember when I headed up a risk and compliance function at a pharmaceuticals company, the UDRL X11 regulations were published. We had 9 months to prepare for it. Good amount of time to get ready to become compliant and be compliant from day one. When it comes to some of these short-term regulatory changes through COVID, when we see all the risk events through supply chain disruptions, we don't have months to prepare for these things. We have to do that fast. So we have to make decisions with less information. So we need all of the information we can get. We need all of the value that's locked away in systems of records in the organization, put in a place where we can consume that information and allow us to make better informed decisions quickly. This diagram looks quite complex. ServiceNow, cloud-based platform. You can actually have an on-premise cloud if you want, but it's still a cloud-based platform. As you can see, there's a lot going on there. You've got information on your physical estate, your IT estate, your asset data, your service data. That's how ServiceNow started as a platform, an asset database, configuration management database, your service management processes like your incident management, your change management. You've also got business processes running through the platform. You have workflows going through the platform, a lot of platform automation. ServiceNow also has a very powerful risk management engine and a controls and compliance engine. What's not shown in that cloud bubble is there's a strong audit management engine, and there's also business continuity capability in there. But there's a lot of capability there. And you can see already today, it's not uncommon for there to be a number of feeds into the platform, particularly in the security operations space. ServiceNow has partnered with all of these, with many technology companies to develop integrations to bring that data in, so the ServiceNow can be used as a single source of truth, if you like, or a trusted source of federated truth, that single pane of glass, the rationalized view, but also using the orchestration capability to turn it into a system of action. So you've got things like vulnerabilities. You can bring in vulnerability related data, get your estate scanned to determine what vulnerabilities you have, enriching that capability with your threat intelligence data. You've got your CM data, security related data, detection data. System can consume that, rationalize it. You can manage it, make decisions, and you can use the orchestration to actually action events, actually go integrate to SECM and go instruct it to actually do stuff, perform tasks on your Windows estate, for example. And then, of course, all of that information goes up through the powerful reporting and analytics engines. A lot going on. That's within the ServiceNow domain. Now, okay, it's covering your IT estate, and that includes a lot of your cyber risk, your cyber controls. That's great. Now, what about all the other risks controls, all the transactional data that's not there? How do we get that in? So if we look at SAP, number of customers have heritage SAP systems. You could be using SAP for managing risks, managing controls. What we can do, or we are developing capability for currently in Turnkey, is a means of an integration to bring that data into ServiceNow. Now, the data is still managed at source. Those risks in SAP, those controls in SAP, they are mastered and managed at source. That doesn't change. But what we do is we bring in a copy of that data in as near to real time as you wish into the platform, so that it can be consolidated with the rest of the risk and compliance data, so that ServiceNow as a whole has full visibility and transparency of that risk and control data that has come from SAP, and you can make decisions across the entire data set then. So that's a very powerful addition. You've got two platforms working together in harmony, turning ServiceNow into that single consolidated view, a system of insight, as we call it, but then you can use it as a system of action as well. Then we can take that a stage further. If you look at all of your other systems, anything that manages information, I've called them heritage systems of record, business applications. You've got all of this transactional data managed at source, mastered at source. How can we bring that data in so that the ServiceNow IRM engines can consume it for the purpose of understanding risk exposures, understanding compliance status? There's three basic ways of attacking this. First of all, the nirvana situation. is where there is already an off-the-shelf integration. There are a large number of off-the-shelf integrations already in existence. If a particular system of record falls into that category, perfect. You plug in the integration, do some configuration work, and very quickly you're up and running, and that data is streaming into ServiceNow for you to use as a system of action. That's the nirvana. If there isn't a pre-built integration, can we build an integration? In some cases, yes. Some systems have been designed that they have the ability to allow things like API connections, so you can tap into the systems, get the data out of them, bring the data into ServiceNow. That's a standard development type activity that can be done on the ServiceNow platform. Standard as in it's a known piece of work following known standards and practices in API development and configuration. It takes a bit of time, obviously. You need a good quality developer to spend maybe a month of their time building the integration, depending on the number of function points, depending on whether it's a one-way or two-way integration. For the use cases we're talking about here, we are talking a one-way feed into ServiceNow so that the system, the data, the transactional data is always mastered and managed at source. So that's the second scenario. Now, the third scenario, what about all those heritage systems that were just not designed to be connected in this way? How do we unlock that data? So I've dealt with this a number of times over the years. I've been working with ServiceNow as a platform for about a decade now, and I've seen many solutions that have involved what's called an ETL, that is extract, transform, load. So for a system that isn't designed to be connected, you extract the data, then you do some pre-processing of the data. That's the transform piece. And then you load that data into ServiceNow using the standard ServiceNow platform capabilities for loading data sources. And that's a very controlled process that's configurable by a competent developer or ServiceNow administrator. But the extract, transform, load is a nice way of bringing data into ServiceNow, transactional data, getting it out of systems that just weren't designed to hand over their data, bringing the data into ServiceNow, consolidating it into the platform. And the purpose of it is really to use that transactional data for managing your risks, managing your controls. So you could look across a whole data set to look for changes, indications that something is different, something has happened, something is trending. So that's your risk indicators or your compliance indicators, using a broad data set to do that. The data set would be coming in through an ETL, and you can have the ETL run as close to real time as you're able to make it work. There's lots of security and other considerations, of course, in terms of getting the data out of the heritage system. Are you going to push the data or are you going to pull the data? The owners of the data, the owners of the system, your information security people, they all need to be part of those discussions to determine what the right approach is, how we get the data out, where we put the data for the purpose of staging for ServiceNow, the need for looking at encryption of the data at rest, encryption of the data in transit, all of the technical considerations. But there's nothing new in this. It's all established functionality, taking data, transforming data, loading the data somewhere else. This slide is just here for completeness. What it's basically showing is if you look at an organization in, say, looking at cybersecurity, you've information and technology, you've got all of these siloed functions, you've got all of these tools, and companies have invested an awful lot in many tool sets, but they still don't get that system of insight and single system of action, and that's what we're trying to get to. So all of these icons you see on the screen, many of them have existing capability to bring data into ServiceNow. Not all of them, but most of them do. But ServiceNow acts as this single pane of glass to make sense of it all. But of course, we can use the ETL concept or build integrations where possible to bring data in from any of your systems of record and unlock that value. Next, I want to talk about how do we respond quickly to these changes in legal and regulatory requirements. Some requirements like UK SOX, yes, we're going to have maybe a number of months to prepare for it. Other changes, you may have weeks, days to prepare for. How do you do that? What does that process look like? How do we do it fast? The first point is regulatory intelligence. Where are you getting your intelligence from? So several sources. You can sign up for a regulatory intelligence feed. That's one easy way of getting in the data. The industries you operate in, it's not uncommon for there to be an industry specific forum that you work with to understand the regulatory requirements that are coming in and how you need to respond. And also you can have your people do it themselves, constantly getting RSS feeds and doing their own monitoring. But either way, you've got to identify what is changing in the legal and regulatory space. And then you invoke some form of regulatory change management. Now, when I used to do this as my day job, we had an internal change control process for managing our system of controls. You can utilize other things like there's a module called regulatory change management that's been introduced into the ServiceNow IRM suite. But either way, you've got to go through some process of regulatory change management. Invoke that process to get things moving. And then you're looking at cataloging what these authority documents are. By authority document, we mean an external source of legal or regulatory or other requirements that you need to demonstrate some form of compliance posture to. Cataloging is the simple step. But then now you've got to look at what the mandates are. So we call them citations. What are all the mandates within those authority documents? What is it you need to comply with? And now comes the smart part. Now, when I say smart, this process that I'm laying out here, this is based on an established compliance mapping process called the UCF. UCF has been around since around about 2002 at the start of Sarbanes-Oxley. This is an established process, one that's been demonstrated as working very effectively. You can either get a subscription with UCF and use their platform to help you do this, or you do this yourself. A lot of this we do manually in some shape or form anyway. The trick here, in order to do it fast, is to automate as much as possible. But the process step I've just highlighted is the clever part, which is looking at a citation and basically tagging the atomic components of it. So you've got a lot of sentences, sometimes very verbose sentences, but ultimately you can distill those sentences down to an action, a verb, and the target of the action, the noun. So the mandate is basically a collection of nouns and verbs. You may find there's secondary nouns, secondary verbs. So there may be a primary action, but then there's a secondary action. There's the target, which is the primary noun, but then there's the organization or the group that does the action. So there's a secondary noun involved. You might even find when you look at a citation, it's written in a way that there's actually multiple mandates there. So really, if you want granularity, you're talking about that translating into multiple controls, one for each of the mandates. It depends on what level of granularity you need to track your compliance to. And there has to be a balance between transparency of compliance versus the workload it's going to generate. But again, automation is the key to speeding this up. The next part is, how do we match mandates to controls? Well, that's made a lot easier having decomposed the mandates into a collection of nouns and verbs. It's much quicker and simpler to be able to match them to existing controls. You take, for example, the requirement to do a risk and impact assessment on all IT system changes. That requirement, that mandate, you're going to find in a number of places. You'll find it somewhere in COBIT. You'll find it in ISO 20000. You'll likely find it in ISO 27001. You're going to find it in the NIST framework. So it's not uncommon that the same mandate exists in multiple sources, multiple authority documents. You've got to find them though. And the key to finding them is to decompose the mandates down into their atomic elements of nouns and verbs so that you can match them. You can do it manually. I've done it manually. It does work. It's a little slow manually. As I said, that the key to making this whole process fast, and we need to make this as fast as possible, automate all of this as much as possible. And then the next smart piece is deduplicating the controls. And that graph I've got on another slide to make it a bit bigger and more readable, so you don't wish you'd gone to Specsavers. But in deduplicating the controls, if I can say it, this is now where you're looking at where you've got a set of controls and you realize that actually some of those controls are duplicate controls, or they're controls that you're already doing in the organization. So you don't need to stand them up again to comply with the new authority document requirements. So you're finding the common controls, you're deduplicating them. So you've got an optimum control set, and then basically it's then a matter of instantiating those controls, creating them in your IRM system. And once you've got the controls created, you can do attestations on them. That's manual, of course, requires intervention. Ultimately, you want to be able to do automatic indicators, continual compliance monitoring, so it's light touch. So the engines of IRM can look at your transactional data, run the indicators automatically without any human intervention. So this is a process that is tried and tested. It works effectively. You can do a lot of it yourself, but of course, the key to speeding this up is to automate each step as much as possible. If you can automate that importing of the regulatory intelligence, and there's solutions out there for doing that. If you want to automate your regulatory change management, or at least have a more structured process for doing it, there's offerings for that. A lot of the following steps in terms of pulling out citations, tagging, matching to controls, deduplication, you can do that yourself, or you can subscribe to UCF's platform and they'll accelerate that for you. And I've no doubt there's other platforms out there that can do something similar. But this is a general proven methodology for bringing in those requirements, standing them up. So you go all the way from the regulatory intelligence all the way through to controls being continuously monitored with light touch, no human intervention. I'm going to hand over to Emlyn for this slide, but before we do that, I'm just going to show you this slide. This was the eye test on the previous picture. So what I've done here is I've taken a sample of authority documents. So you've got things like 21 CFR Part 11, which is regulated electronic records and signatures from life sciences. I used to work in life sciences, very dear to my heart. You've got Sarbanes-Oxley there. You've got COSO 2013, NIST, ISO 20,000, GDPR. So as you can see, as you start adding more authority documents, the number of mandates, the blue line, is going up very sharply. But when you deduplicate the controls, the rate of change is a lot slower. So in this example, instead of having to instantiate 3,372 control objectives, we only have to instantiate 1,330. That's a considerable reduction. So you've got a 61% deduplication rate. Now, I've seen much higher deduplication rates than that. One customer I worked with last year was able to achieve a deduplication rate of approximately 85% based on the set of authority documents that they were needing to show compliance to. And what I've done in that diagram is I've taken the authority documents with the smallest number of mandates first, and then COVID-19 at the end is got the largest number of authority documents. Of course, if I'd swapped the order, you'd have seen a slightly different curve. It would have been a sharply rising curve that then flattened off towards the end. And that's what you find when you do the deduplication, the number of controls tends to plateau. And that's what you want. And once you've got a mechanism in place to identify the duplicate controls and automatically, then you can very quickly optimize your control set. So I'm just going to hand over to Emlyn now, because Emlyn's going to speak about continuous controls monitoring.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so just really wanted to bring to life some of the conversations that you were touching on earlier. And I think when we start to look at the complex nature of a lot of organizations' internal systems and landscapes, is we see potentially a lot of sunken costs that you have within your organization to invest in GRC solutions like the metric stream, Archer, Open Pages, etc. And what we're trying to really emphasize here is when with ServiceNow, we're not necessarily saying that you need to sort of move away from that sunken cost you've got. There are certain elements that you'll have when certain solutions that you have currently today, where having those platforms and having those products in place makes sense to continue to use and continue to adopt. And it's really around how do you have one central view of all of the controls that you have within your organization and how those are operating in a single system and a single source of record. And that's really where we start to see a lot of customers starting to look at where ServiceNow can play that centralization approach and look at a set of controls across all the domains within your organization. So if I take a perfect example, if we look at something around financial control data, if you're using SAP and SAP GRC, for example, for monitoring financial controls, that's a proven, a tested framework. It's been in place potentially for a while. This is where ServiceNow can start to work together with solutions that you have in legacy solutions that you have within your organization to start to bring that overall centralized view around control. The issue that we have is for some of those platforms, and SAP being one, is how the amount of you can sort of broaden outside of the domain in terms of that system, the data that sits within that system, and start to sort of broaden the view around sort of the way procurement controls are operating, or IT controls, or health and safety controls. The ability to really broaden out that scope becomes limited. And that's where ServiceNow, with the various capabilities that we have embedded in the platform, can start to do what we refer to as holistic enterprise control monitoring. So we're looking at not just a subset of data or a subset of controls, but we're looking at all of controls. And that's where we can start to really play alongside those solutions that you already have embedded to really give that sort of centralized view around control. So when we're looking at working with organizations and platforms that they have today, first point of call is really understanding where do we hold data within our environment. So understanding where the core data sets that we hold. So if it's a specific data set on procurement data, that might be in a procurement solution like Coupa or Reba or a few others in that domain. If we're looking at, say, data that we're holding from a finance perspective, that might be in an SAP environment. So you might have a whole bunch of data sets that you have within your organization where those data sets are held in various disparate solutions. Where ServiceNow comes is it acts as that orchestration layer across all of them. So we often will have to say, if we need to get information on how, say, our financial controls are operating, we'd have to then dig into SAP and run a report in SAP, and then we'll get an outcome. What we can see is ServiceNow will give you that ability through API integrations to then be able to interrogate any one of those areas. So if you're wanting to look at sort of finance controls plus procurement controls plus IT controls in one sort of view, you can start to make those connections and run those analyses within ServiceNow. And that's really where we start to operate this process around sort of control monitoring or CCM, where we can define those indicators and then look at those systems of record where that data sits, and we can start to then monitor those data sets using a set of rule sets and criteria that we're embedding in. So it becomes a lot more easier for us to manage that holistic life cycle around controls just by the use of those rule sets that we have within our system. And those can be run on a periodic basis, sort of a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And it can really start to feed into the broader campaign that you have around assurance as well. So we're not doing assurance on all controls. And I think sort of one of the big findings that we've had is organizations are now starting to move away from how we do assurance and what we do assurance on. So when our assurance scope becomes sort of heavy around controls that we know are operating and we know are effective, and every year we revisit the same controls, we're basically wasting effort on those specific sets of controls. So where we can start to target and really sort of highlight which controls we focus on, and we're using the data to guide us where those issues lie, we can start to really drive a reduction in the amount of assurance that we're performing, but also a better targeting on the areas that we're performing assurance. And that's really through the leveraging of those control monitoring outcomes. So we can start to get a better sense of the true problem areas and the true problem areas within our system. And we are seeing regulation playing a big role in this as well. So the need to standardize to be able to get a proper effective control framework in place, specifically with the likes of the introduction, the conversation around UK stocks. How do organizations be able to manage these specific requirements that they're getting in a much more efficient and seamless manner? So we're not having to dedicate additional heads, because that's typically the approach a lot of organizations will place is we've got a new requirement, we bring new people in to manage that requirement. But how do we get more efficient as an organization, that we have less reliance on people doing manual work and more reliance on systems doing the checking and scoping and directing the work to be performed? And that's really where we start to see the reliance on the people become more from insight perspective. So we're not wasting resources that we have internally, focusing on elements that potentially we know are going to be effective, or potentially we know are less risky, but we really are driving the insights that we have and the experience to have within our headcount to really target those areas that we want to see more information back from, and we actually want to investigate further. Thanks, Phil. I'll hand it back to you.
So we're almost at the end of the slide back here. I'm just going to put this slide up finally. One of the challenges that you can have in the controls space especially is managing the right number of controls in an optimum way. If you take, for example, a control that applies to a physical building, fire risk, flood risk, or whatever, those controls would apply to physical buildings. They wouldn't apply to a software license. It would make no sense. So understanding what control applies to what target is important. If you've got, say, 20 data centers and you've got the control objective of as you can see on the screen, design an alternative facility in the continuity plan. In theory, you've got 20 controls created out of that. That's fine. That's manageable. 20 controls, 20 facilities, 20 control owners. When you get into the deeper layers of your IT estate, however, the number of targets of the controls very quickly goes up off the scale into thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The deeper you go into your CMDB and asset database, the more controls you have. It gets to the point it's just not physically possible for people to manage large numbers of control sets manually. You have to automate the management of those controls. There's two approaches, one of which is you could have, if you like, a super control. So a control owner can attest to all the servers in a particular data center. It works, it gets you some form of control attestation, but it's not really a granular enough level of reporting. What you need is automated controls monitoring. That is a must, so that you can create tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of controls from all of the items as necessary in your configuration management database. If you've got automatic compliance monitoring sitting on top of them, ServiceNow will do all the hard work of managing the controls, managing the compliance status. So this is a great productivity boost in the engines, powerful automation for being able to manage risks and controls at a very, very large scale in a hands-off manner. So that's where the power of the automation comes in. And if we import data, for example, risk data, control data from other systems like SAP, we can choose the level of granularity we bring the information in. It might just be relevant to bring the information in at an aggregate layer. So on this diagram, you've got concepts of risk statements, which if we take, say, the earthquake risk, which applies to a number of physical facilities, that rolls up to a risk statement covering earthquake in general. So you can look at your risk exposure for earthquake across all of it. By having the controls in each entity, of course, you can drill into those controls, see specific status, see specific risks, do all the analysis. You've got full transparency and the ability to drill down to the lowest level of detail for the purpose of proactively managing. But using the automation to make sure that all of this is managed at scale by the automated engines. And that's where Emily's picture comes in, where we're showing all of the roll-ups and the continuous controls monitoring to give you that visibility without the manual overhead of maintaining at a very detailed level. So that's all we've got for today's presentation. I hope it's been very useful. Do feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will be taking time to answer them all. Thank you.
So I think we've got one question in there, Phil. I think one which was saying, where does SAP GRC stop and ServiceNow start in ideal implementation? It's a good question. So it's really around where you want to start to drive your scope. So from an SAP GRC perspective, a lot of the time we'll see people focusing on core financial controls. So if we got embedded things like SAP GRC from a process control perspective, looking at what are those controls that we already have embedded and that we're looking to monitor data from within SAP. And we typically see the focus that are being provided or stopped at that level. Where you've got certain financial controls, which might leverage data that sits outside of SAP, for example, that's where we start to see organizations starting to leverage ServiceNow to take ownership over those basically those controls that sit outside of that remit of the data that sits within ServiceNow. So it's really around identifying what data sets do you have, and then basically looking at where the rest of the data sits and which data sets they are, and then looking at where you define the indicators for those specific controls. So having that view of where your data lies becomes really important, because that's where you can make the decision as to which platform you use in which context. I think we've got some other questions. So one of the questions I think it's to Alex is, as organizations get put under more and more pressure to rationalize spend, what areas tend to be the first to be targeted within the risk and compliance area?
Yeah, so I think we unfortunately don't have these magical unlimited porridge pots of money within organizations. So we have to make calls around where we spend. GRC and topics such as compliance and risk are not revenue generating. They're a cost to an organization, and therefore quite rightly we're challenged around those costs regularly. I think you can, and Phil alluded to it earlier, the first place you can do is by looking at the deduplication around frameworks. So not treating every framework as a separate exercise, but combining together to build this kind of ask once, answer many framework of control. So you're meeting your obligations and the various kind of requirements that those sources of governance are putting on you in the most efficient way possible. You can then look at the other side as well to say, well, how many instances of control are we deploying around the organization? Now that's a trickier one, because that's essentially simplification of the organization, simplification of vendor supply chains, and that's quite often outside of our control, outside of our power. So those would be much bigger transformation projects, but certainly by doing those sorts of activities, we are reducing the burden of compliance. So then you start to get into automation, and I think you very quickly start to look towards technology. I think 10, 20 years ago, we were not looking at systems that could roll out changes to development changes to our production systems within hours. This is all kind of very hand cranked. It was very slow, and everything around it was very slow. Now that we can do these things really quickly, they're very complex. And although we sped up those systems, we didn't speed up the associated control and mechanisms of control and risk management. And so really, we've kind of ended up in a place where the environment is much more complicated, but we're being squeezed in terms of the amount of resource we are given to deal with those challenges. So the only direction is to automate, is to look at continuous control monitoring, is to look at taking those automated systems, figuring out how they operate, figuring out the control points, the measurement points, and then leveraging that in your control data and automating. I know Phil mentioned that it's the only way to manage, and I think that's true. I think you have to bring in those automated sources. You have to start using indicators. There was an insurance company I spoke to recently referred to it as sensors in the business. You have to deploy as many automated sensors within your business that give you that information and let you know where to look, because you don't have as many people as you did before. So I think that's where I would look to for my kind of cost cutting, is deduping, simplification, and trying to reduce headcount through automation.
So we've got another question there, I think, for ServiceNow. What is your view on UK SOX and the impact on controls management? So I think my view, I'll give my view and I'll let Alex answer that as well. But I think from my perspective, it's really around how are organizations going to start to put a lot more focus and attention on how they manage controls within their organizations here in the UK. And I think for a lot of customers, they potentially will have already some SOX requirements. Where I see UK SOX being different to, say, the US SOX is, I don't think it's going to be as prescriptive and rules-based. I think this is going to be more, I think that the way that they'll structure it is going to allow some degree of sort of choice at the customer level in terms of how they proactively define what their controls are. Where we see ServiceNow becoming much more centric to that is it gives you that level of rigor from a controls library perspective, in terms of having a central view of which controls you have within your organization, the ability to then also manage them through a formal engine. So we have a clear view of ownership of control, also a clear view of where those control points lie and where potentially you have control issues, and areas where those controls are not as optimal. And an easier way to start to report on control data. I think the regulators can be very quick to say it's unacceptable to have an excuse to say we don't have visibility of all of our controls, or we don't have an ability to understand where our control issues lie and how significant they are. So having ServiceNow as that platform to really drive the ability for you to come to those conclusions quickly, to react to changes fast, and also to really sort of put some formality around some of the focus areas. I think from the Bryden report, the focus areas around fraud and a few areas similar to that, where you've got to have a better handle on what the requirements are, how you manage those specific risks, and having clear line of sight between, say, a given risk and a specific control. Alex, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, it's a good response, I think, from you there. I think the only thing I'd pick up on there and just re-stress is I think the regulations that are coming out now, we're finding much more principles-based regulations coming out. So a lot less prescriptive, a lot more kind of down to interpretation and kind of figuring things out as we go, which provides an amount of flexibility to the interpretation and making sure that we're maintaining the spirit of the regulation rather than the specifics of a control objective. The downside of that means that there's work to be done. There's no magical automated systems of to make this stuff go through. You'll have to run through. You'll have to see how it applies to your organization, and in there will be efficiencies. Any sort of automated lists or straightforward lists are usually full of inefficiencies or irrelevant controls, depending on your situation. But when you're given the principles-based controls, you can do a lot more with it. So. Yeah, I think there's an opportunity in there, but there's also more work, as there always will be with increasing regulation. I don't think we can escape it. There's a question in here from someone around: is the CMDB maintained in ServiceNow a hard prerequisite for risk management? I'll let Emlyn answer more than I, but I think the answer to that is a resounding no. But clearly, we're in a very unique position that CMDB is native to ServiceNow. So having the information present is hugely beneficial. Back to the continuous controls monitoring, changing the environment, complex environments. If that CMDB is your source of all solutions around that, to know what is there, what is going on, what the changes are. So Emily, I'll let you answer more thoroughly than I.
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, and Phil, I don't know if you can flick back to the slide that I spoke to. I was probably be able to explain it a bit easier. I think it's really around the benefit that you have of having the data available to you. So as I mentioned before, in terms of the control monitoring side, even from a risk management perspective, if you have data that sits within ServiceNow and that CMDB data, it's obviously going to enable you to produce insights and various points that you want to understand easier if the data resides natively within that platform. So that's where we sort of say, from an SAP perspective, you've got financial data in SAP, the data resides there. Being able to drive insights and draw insights from a financial control perspective becomes much easier if you're doing it within that system. Does not mean you have to have a fully populated CMDB within ServiceNow. That's really where we start to look at our integration capabilities, and if that information lies somewhere else, we'd be obviously pulling from that data set. The more and more data that you have in ServiceNow, and obviously the more insights that you can draw off that data, the more beneficial it will become. But it's definitely not a prerequisite by any means. I think that's where, similarly, if you'd buy an off-the-shelf GRC platform today that has no data in it, an empty shell, you can use ServiceNow in the same light. It's only going to just improve the insight that you have access to within ServiceNow with whatever data resides within that platform.
To add to that, of course, the capability to populate the CMDB in ServiceNow is capability that's been around for a good decade. It's very well established. A CMDB, well, if you look at, say, best practice guidance of ITIL, it talks more about a configuration management system where your CMDB is a trusted source of federated truth. It's not a single source of truth. It's a federated source, and it's able to be a federated source because it pulls the data from sources. So where you've got your configuration data managed at source within technology specific tool sets. So Windows servers, they have tool sets like SECM that have native management capability for managing those configuration items. Similarly, with many other technologies, there's native tool sets around that manage that configuration data. But it's a very straightforward matter to bring that data into ServiceNow, and that's very tried and trusted capability with many companies across the globe doing just that, bringing in those federated sources to populate the CMDB, because then you've got all of your physical IT estate, even if it's in the cloud, you're bringing it all in. Then you've got all of that estate as to be able to act and provide added value to GRC. It's not a necessary prerequisite of GRC, depending on what you're trying to achieve, but it's a huge source of valuable data and insight that can be brought into ServiceNow very easily.
Phil, if I just ask you a kind of question from my side, and then so perhaps probe into this. I think one of the things you brought up that's quite interesting is the entity structures and the modeling up. With this ever-growing pot of configuration data and other such things, kind of how important and what are the sort of techniques that you see work to abstracting away from the volume and the complexity to something you can manage at a higher level? What the strategies there?
The strategy is really about understanding, if you look at a control objective, how to apply it for the right result that you're looking for. So in some cases, you will need to see a control objective applied to a large number of configuration items. So for example, the need to have two-factor authentication into every business application. So that control objective you could apply to your business applications. If you've got a portfolio of 500 business applications, you've got 500 controls there straight away. ServiceNow will create the controls for you. You don't have to do the hard work of keying in the controls. You just tell the RM engine what to apply the control to. Say, right, apply to all the production business applications. And the automation goes out, creates the controls, assigns the control to an accountable person. And then, of course, you can do your automated indicators for tracking the control, rather than having each application owner or business owner do a manual attestation. So it's all about understanding the level in which you want to manage a control, whether you're going to manage it at an individual configuration item level or manage it at more of a governance level. So a control around the need for the organization to have a change control process. You would structure that control so it's one per organization typically. You wouldn't target that control on every IT system. You would target the control, which is the need for an organization to have the process in place at an organizational level. So the key is understanding what control objectives apply to, making that intelligent decision. Because if you're going to create a large number of controls, you've got to stand up the automation to manage them. It's not realistic to ask a control owner to attest, say, 100 controls every week, even though you can group them together and say, well, this 51 are compliant, that 49 are non-compliant. The more human interaction you need to manage these controls, the more chance for error there is. So you've really got to target the automation, but get those control structures in place. And the key to it from this diagram is what's called those entity types. So if you look at, say, an internal policy of an organization, policies state what they apply to or who they apply to, statements of applicability. Your entity types are basically your electronic statements of applicability. So what you need to do is take those statements of applicability, create them in ServiceNow IRM as entity types, and then let the engine do the work of creating your risks and your controls accordingly.
Just to add in there, I also emphasize that when you are choosing what you're scoping on, so from a context perspective, as we're talking about those entity types, specifically down to your control objectives, it's around how you set those up. So if it's important for you to know, as take the example of the two-factor authentication, if it's important for you to know all your business applications, whether they have two-factor authentication on or not, that you set the control up together with that control monitoring indicator alongside it. So therefore, you're not adding burden into the business by enforcing new requirements to be checked, but you're actually letting the system do the work for you, and therefore reduce that overall effort and impact on the business.
I think there is a point around strategy of testing, isn't there? Where do you want to test your control? How can you test your control, and not going too far down that chain, unless of course there's complexity that needs to be uncovered within controls that sit underneath that, of course. But I think to your point, Phil, I think that's where you have to think about your automation strategy before you do it as well. So interesting. Thanks, guys.
I've got one other question for you, Phil. In terms of the regulatory side of things, how do you see the process of bringing in regulatory change into your system and addressing what those changes are, being a fully automated approach, or do you still see the need for human interaction, and how does that human interaction get structured in a future world where systems are leveraged to manage that process?
Well, we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately, so I'm not going to be able to answer the question in full. The answer actually is within this slide, where you can automate that tagging of the atomic elements of each mandate to identify what the control is and whether that control is a unique control or one you already have. That's the simple answer. That can be automated to a large degree.
Cool. Thanks, Tom.
And with that, thank you. We do have to wrap up, and I think we've overrun our allocation by a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.